Okay, so we're going to talk about human demographics. Of course, human demographics is the study of a specific population. So we could look at a specific country, we could look at a city, or we could look at the global human population. And as we've seen with the graphs, most population growth is very recent. Most human population growth, very recent. And I could redraw the graph, but I'm sure you all are very familiar with it by now. Moving through time, really sort of constant, fairly slow increase until about the Industrial Revolution, when it starts to curve up and become very dramatically steep in a classic J-curve, exponential growth. So there's different theories about how this will keep changing. Could potentially go up to 11 billion or so, but as we saw from Hans, likely it's going to start flattening out over time and sort of stabilize somewhere around 8 to 10 billion people, perhaps. So one of the big questions is why the growth? What is causing such a huge increase in human population at that one specific point in time, and why did it sort of take so long? So there's a few different factors that are sort of playing in here. We had an increase in food and nutrition. So maybe we saw an initial increase with the agricultural revolution as humans started to settle down, establish cities. All of a sudden you could support much larger populations. There have been further advancements in food and agriculture, especially with the so-called Green Revolution in the 1950s. Which was when a lot of pesticides were introduced, a lot of mechanized farming and machines. And this really increased our output of food sort of exponentially compared to what had been before. Another big increase would be increased public health and access to medicine. Of course, if people are able to live longer and healthier lives, that will increase the population. Another big factor would be increased sanitation. This is something we kind of take for granted, but in a lot of places, you might not have access to running water. You might not have access to flush toilets. So sanitation is a really big one and sort of really directly linked with public health. And then along with sanitation, if you have those nice systems to keep your waste separate, we also have an improvement in clean water and access to safe drinking water. So all of these factors has helped to really increase the population of the entire planet. So most of this population growth is happening in LEDCs, less economically developed countries. So if you're looking at sort of these factors, it might make sense as to why a lot of this population growth is happening in these places. Because until recently, they might have had a harder time accessing food, a harder time accessing medicines, sanitation, etc. So this is where much of the growth has happened and why we've seen such a huge growth in countries that are especially developing, China, India, etc. So human population has doubled within these periods. So from 1809 to 1922, from 1922 to 1959, and finally from 1959 to 1974. You might notice that the time span of these is getting shorter and shorter, right? We have over 100 years for this doubling time to about 37 years for this doubling time to less than 20 years. And now it's happening really relatively quickly. However, as we've seen in the video, population growth worldwide has slowed since the turn of the century. since the early 2000s, as people have better access to these sorts of things, they sort of slow their reproduction rates. And then by 2050, the women on average will have 2 children. And we're actually really close to this number now. I think currently we're at roughly like 2.5. So we're actually super close to this. So this 2 children number is again related to replacement fertility. Replacement fertility is a good word to know. Again, this is just the number of children that will replace you and your partner. So generally 2 parents equals 2 children. This number might vary, again, based on factors related to this. So if you have increased childhood mortality, you might have to have a little bit extra children to kind of make up for those childhood deaths. However, as we improve childhood mortality rates, this number can get closer and closer to 2. This is sort of like in the video when he talked about early in the 1800s and earlier, when people used to have many children, 5, 6, 7, 8 children. However, most of them would not make it well into adulthood, so they'd end up with roughly 2 or 3 kids that actually succeeded through life. There's a few factors that sort of have an impact on this. One of the really big ones is the AIDS epidemic. And the AIDS epidemic, as you might guess, has an especially large impact. Impacts those LADCs. Because for one thing, they have less access to contraceptives, to condoms, things for safe sex and reproduction. And for another thing, they also have way less treatment. In a developed country, you could sort of live a relatively normal, healthy life while being HIV positive. But if you don't have the access to medicines and hospitals, then it's going to be a lot harder for you. And you can actually see, like in Malawi, one of our closest contacts actually is HIV positive, and thankfully he's doing pretty well right now. But we're always kind of concerned about him getting something like malaria with his compromised immune system could be especially a problem. But as we saw again in the video, as population continues to grow, the overall trend is an aging population. An aging world population. So generally, we're still having roughly 2 children after childhood mortality comes into place. So as people have longer life expectancies, the total age will increase. All right, I'm going to pause and clear the board. Oof. Okay, so now we're going to look at specific variables that go into population changes and how demographics shift over time. So these variables will be population increases and population decreases. Let's look at population decreases to start. Population decreases. So as you might guess, the main way a population decreases is when people die. Pretty obvious. So this is where our calculation for crude death rate comes into play. Crude death rate, also known as CDR. So this term, crude, just sort of refers to the data being unprocessed. So when we say crude oil, that's oil that we get directly out of the ground. Usually you have to send that to a refinery to process it, get rid of all the impurities, make it useful in making plastics or running your cars, burning, etc. So in this case, it's just a really unprocessed piece of data. So kind of just the crude, sort of just natural rate. So this is equal to the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals. per 1,000 individuals. Do a little divide sign there because it says per. So this is not necessarily a great measure. As we said, it is crude. So better measurements might be like an age-specific mortality rates. So if you have age-specific mortality, then you can actually see, is it older folks that are dying? It's somewhere in the middle. Perhaps you have one country where there's higher rates of childhood mortality. So this would tell you whether these people are having a longer life expectancy or a shorter life expectancy. And then another sort of informative measure is infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates, or IMR. Again, sort of informing you more about sort of the dynamics of the country, if there's other sorts of things in play. So we can consider different factors that may affect these decreases in population. So these factors could include whether the population is old or young. Is the population old or young? It could be whether it's an LEDC or MEDC. Poorer countries tend to have higher mortality as they have less access to safe drinking water, sanitation, hospitals, etc. Certain occupations might have higher mortality as well. Perhaps you've seen that show, Deadliest Catch, about the crab fishermen. Rather deadly position. There are also different jobs that have an even higher mortality rate than that one. And maybe you're in a country that doesn't have as much sort of economic strength, so you might not have as many worker safety conditions. Perhaps it's unfeasible to get a lot of safety equipment, protective equipment for your workers. There tends to be higher infant mortality rates in LEDCs as well. Higher infant mortality rates, again over here, IMR, in LEDCs. And then you might also have higher rates in areas where there's poor sanitation, poor access to healthcare, etc. Poor sanitation, little healthcare, healthcare, etc. Okay. So these are sort of the main focus of population decreases. In this case, we don't account for immigration, people coming into a country, or emigration, people leaving a country. It's a little bit hard to measure sometimes, but this is just, again, sort of the crude measurements. So we're just kind of looking at, without all those additional factors, how is the country's population changing? I'm going to pause once again and erase this for crude birth rates. Okay, so now looking at the opposite side, we're going to look at different things that would increase a population. Population increases. So we had crude death rates before, so now we're going to have crude birth rates, or CBR. And again, just like with crude death rates, these are unprocessed values. So we're just looking at the total number of births per 1,000 people in a certain country or region. So if you wanted to actually do this equation, you would just find the number of births in an area, find the population of the country divided by 1,000, and then just run that equation. Again, these are not necessarily the best measurements. They kind of tell us in general if the population is growing, but they don't really tell us specifically how that population is growing and any further details. So we can look at a few different measurements. We could look at the total fertility rate. Total fertility rate. And again, fertility is the ability to have babies. So if you're fertile, you can have lots of babies. And if you're infertile, you cannot have any. So this is looking at the average number of births. Average number of births per woman of childbearing age. Of childbearing age. If you've never seen this symbol before, just a nice little symbol representing women. And then there's also this symbol representing males. And then if you're Prince, you'll do a little combination of both of them. I think that's the symbol that the artist formerly known as Prince used to use. So total fertility rate is useful because that can sort of tell us, for one thing, you might have certain populations that have different ratios of men to women, right? Some countries are actually not 50-50. In places like India, there's more of an incentive to have males, so there actually can be a larger male population. So looking at just the number of births per woman of childbearing age kind of tells us a little bit more about whether that population is like regularly fertile. Maybe there's lower fertility rates due to some other sort of environmental factor, etc. But a little bit more detailed measurement here in total fertility rates. Box that off. And then we could look at the natural increase rate. We could sort of look at how the population is changing, hopefully increasing, potentially increasing over time. So the natural increase rate, or NIR. Oops. And here's where we're going to start using some of these other variables to make a calculation. So to get this natural increase rate, we're going to take the number of births, CBR, crude birth rate, and we're going to subtract the number of deaths, crude death rate, and then we will multiply by 100. Actually, before we multiply it by 100, we should consider the fact that these are both per 1,000 population. So since we've included that per 1,000 people, we're actually going to divide this value by 10 and then multiply by 100. The reason we're doing this is because it will end up as a percentage. So this will tell you by what percent your population is growing per year. So if it's growing by 100%, that means your population is actually doubling, which should be really, really, really fast. So there's a natural increase rate. And then we're going to do one more calculation using this value. And that's going to be for doubling time. Doubling time, as you might guess, is the amount of time it takes for your population to double. Number of years for population to double. And so to calculate this, doubling time in years, you'll just do the natural increase rate. Or you'll do 70 divided by the natural increase rate. 70 over NIR. And that will give you the doubling time of your population. This is all we're going to do for today. You can use these measurements to sort of create a model to show how countries will evolve in their demographics over time, but we'll save that for another day. We can just leave this for the quiz on Monday, so you should be familiar with these measurements, CBR, TFR, NIR, as well as sort of general information about global population, etc. And once again, you can use any notes on the quiz, so it might be a good idea to copy all this down in your notebook.